Your film is now ready to be shown.
Good morning. I'm Justin Hendricks, editor of Tech Policy Press, a nonprofit media venture intended to provoke new ideas, debate, and discussion at the intersection of technology and democracy. Every year, I pay close attention to the results of the Freedom on the Net report from Freedom House, the nonprofit organization founded in 1941 to advance democracy and human rights. The depth and breadth of the annual reporting, the Freedom House team works with nearly 100 analysts and advisors to produce close analyses of more than 70 countries, makes these documents necessary reading for anyone concerned with issues at the intersection of technology, freedom, and democracy. This week, I had a chance to speak to two of the report's authors.
I'm Ali Funk, Research Director for Technology and Democracy at Freedom House.
Kian Vjestenson, Senior Researcher for Tech and Democracy at Freedom House.
I am so pleased to have the two of you back again this year. This has become a kind of annual tradition for me to have the opportunity to speak to you on the publication of your Freedom on the Net report. This year, unfortunately, it's yet more bad news, a 14th consecutive year in decline on global internet freedom. It's not all bad news. We'll get into some of that. But you're already racking up responses from governments around the world. I note in particular in piece in Al Jazeera, you have the Chinese Ministry of Foreign Affairs spokeswoman saying that China and its people, quote, enjoy various rights and freedoms in accordance with the law. And, quote, as for the so-called report, I think it is entirely baseless and made with ulterior motives. You ranked China very poorly this year. Anything you'd like to add in context?
I would say I'm happy they saw the report. That's great reach for us. And that authoritarians, they don't like to be held accountable. So it's not the first time they've said, and some other governments, we rank not free, that's criticized the research. And I'm sure it won't be the last. But I think that shows actually how right we are, that they're worried, and how impactful our report and the larger internet freedom community can be if you have one of the most powerful governments trying to delegitimize you.
I mean, listen, I think the Chinese government has smeared many fine researched reports as quote unquote so-called findings. And I think it's an honor to be listed among them. To respond to the comment specifically, certainly the Chinese people do enjoy many rights and freedoms, and they would enjoy more if the Chinese Communist Party didn't systematically censor and surveil its people and its internet. Part of what we get at in our report findings is just the extent to which the CCP has sought to wipe dissent off of the Chinese internet. And certainly I hope in the future we'll see that the Chinese people are flourishing, that they have access to even greater rights and freedoms than they do now under the current government.
So I've started in a testy place on this, but I do want to maybe just use it as a jumping off point to ask you about other reactions you've had to the report since it came out just yesterday. We're talking only a day after it's been released. Or other notable responses you've had in the prior year from last year's report. I mean, a lot of the headlines in this report, unfortunately, are very similar. Decline in internet freedom. What are you hearing back from governments as you deliver the bad news?
You get a mix of different comments depending, I think, on the government itself, how free or not free it is, where they put the emphasis. We've gotten in previous years similar comments from Vietnam's government, Pakistan's, Azerbaijan, some of those usual players. But we also get some really constructive engagement from governments. Two that really come to mind is actually three. We had yesterday commentary from the Estonian government, which is second in the index, did see a point decline this year, which we can talk about. But they will be taking the chairship of the Freedom Online Coalition next year. And they celebrated their position and said they hope that they're going to, in their FOC chairship, be able to strengthen the principles of transparency and openness, which I think is a great way of, we have this report, Estonia does really well, but there's opportunities for improvement. They're reading it. And we hope we have the opportunity to chat with them about some of that. And you've seen that throughout Asia Pacific with some of the countries that are free and partly free. We see that in Eurasia with some of those. So you can see how it has a real impact. And then government officials are like, oh, we would love to figure out how we can do better, and then use the report as a roadmap on how to get there.
Some of the responses that make me personally feel the most proud is what we see when civil society and independent media in some of the most repressive countries in the world pick up the report, pick up the findings, and engage with it, reflecting on their own lived experiences, their own desires for change. And we've already seen that in the first 24 hours of pickup, that some of the independent media outlets operating in exile for Cuba, Venezuela, Nicaragua, for example, have engaged really deeply with some of the findings. I think there's always this beautiful constructive back and forth with these organizations where maybe they have some stronger opinions about some of our reporting and they'll engage with it from that direction. Maybe they'll share how their experiences have mirrored some of our findings. And so I think when we see that kind of pickup, it really shows the value of these reports, which frankly, Justin, some of them are dry. We get really wonky, really deep into the weeds, but it really does echo these experiences of some of the folks who are on the front lines of resisting digital repression around the world.
This year's theme is trust, and you focused quite a lot on elections. I mentioned in my little summary of the report that it's perhaps trite now to talk about this being the year of elections. The year is almost over. There's still a couple of major elections in front of us, including the one here in the United States in a couple of weeks. What have you observed around the world on the whole about the information environment and the way that various countries are trying to intercede in the context of elections?
We kind of, in looking at, we really wanted to know how are elections impacting the information environment, because elections serve as a flashpoint for a lot of internet controls, false and misleading information. So you tend to see longstanding issues either exacerbate, bubble up, or you just see the impact of them. But of course, understanding that, I think so many of the trends we're talking about within each country's election environment also has nothing to do with elections as well, right? It matters for just the broader internet freedom environment. So in trying to understand that research question, we found three different trends. So the first one is the ways in which technical censorship, website blocks, social media blocks, internet shutdowns suppressed independent reporting, limited many opposition parties' ability to reach supporters, or in some countries was used to actually suppress claims around election manipulation. Second is how false and misleading claims really sought to undermine the integrity of the vote itself. We tracked in 21 different countries of the 41 that had elections or prepared for them in our coverage period. Pro-government commentators manipulated information. And then the last trend had to do with the ways in which government actors were trying to attack the very people that specialize in actually protecting the information environment. So fact checkers, independent researchers, harassment campaigns against them, partisan pressure, legal attacks. So those were the three main findings of the impact. And we also found some interventions that we might recommend. But when I think about why did we name the report The Struggle for Trust Online, we chose trust because so many of these internet controls were trying to tackle and undermine people's trust in democracy as the best governance system to protect our rights. So it felt like that was an overarching trend across so many different countries, the ones that are more democratic, like the US, or the ones that are more authoritarian, like Azerbaijan.
I want to drill down a little bit into some of those attacks that you mentioned. Here in the States, of course, researchers, independent journalists that I talk to quite a lot, we spend a lot of time worrying about efforts like Jim Jordan's House Select Committee on the Weaponization of the Federal Government and the efforts that House Republicans have taken to try to chill research into disinformation and various other online harms. But it really became clear to me reading this that he's just one of an example of various fauna across the world that are engaged in similar activity. You point to South Korea, you point to India, you point to other nations. Are there, I don't know, patterns you're seeing, phenomena you're seeing that stand out?
I think what's really concerning here for me, Justin, is that this tactic that we had previously seen cropping up in authoritarian aspiring governments around the world is percolating its way through to countries in the democratic spectrum. You mentioned South Korea, India, the US. These are some of the biggest, most robust democratic traditions in the world. And to see these folks, these disinformation researchers and fact checkers, who are really at the vanguard of safeguarding the reliable and diverse internet, coming under attack, it's really scary stuff. Just to dive into the details here a bit for listeners who may be less familiar, there's a couple different angles here that we found over the past year. In India, for example, we saw that the government has actually sought to co-opt the project of fact-checking for its own interests. A few years back, the government passed a law that would essentially empower itself to set up a, quote, fact-checking unit, unquote, that would then issue corrections when it found that media outlets would purportedly report incorrectly on the government. Now, on its face, maybe this is not so concerning, but the Indian government has leveraged every tool in its disposal over the past 8 years or so to go after online dissent, to go after online criticism, to go, to try to silence anyone who's challenging the government line. And so this fact-checking unit posed a real point of concern for Indian civil society and journalism. Thankfully, actually, just a few weeks before we published this report, an Indian court found that this law empowering the government to set up a fact-checking unit was unconstitutional under India's constitution for a lot of the reasons that we discussed here. And this case was actually brought forward by an Indian satirist, a guy who makes jokes for a living, and pointed out the real dangers of this sort of body for free expression in India. So this is really a storyline of what happens when a government tries to claim fact-checking as a part of a broader project to conduct censorship. I think your listeners are probably really familiar with the attacks on the Election Integrity Project here in the US. We saw a similar pattern, unfortunately, in South Korea, where the ruling party really sought to politicize and paint as biased the country's leading fact-checkers. Unfortunately, we see this sort of tactic playing out all over the world when fact-checkers confront a problem that folks here in the US may find relatable, which is that sometimes one political party is responsible for a disproportionate number or volume of false and misleading information relating to politics and elections. And so in that circumstance, fact checkers have to confront a real serious question of, do you fact check everyone evenly at a very one-to-one rate in order to show that you're not biased, or do you fact check based off of what's happening proportionately? And we spoke to folks from all over the world who are encountering this real trade-off in their own electoral contexts.
I want to ask about generative AI. You've also had a year of observing generative AI and its use in various contexts. Last year's report, we were quite down on artificial intelligence as a tool of repression, I think, as it went. What have we observed about the use of AI in this election context?
I'm still down on AI as a tool of repression, just to make that clear. That is my own personal position, but it can still be used in good ways. No, jokes aside. So it was interesting because you're right. We looked at this last year and tracked Gen AI, the early adoption of the technology to distort political and social content online. And this year, you saw Gen AI being used in so many different contexts to create false, misleading information. But what is not clear is the impact, right? You can create this content, but does it get reach? How it's getting spread? is it persuasive? Is it more persuasive than other more traditional tech used in influence operations? We don't have answers to those questions. Part of the reason is there's a large research gap, and even be able to study it, to study the information space, to identify the use of the technology within the campaigns for some of the reasons that Keon just laid out. It's not a super robust environment right now for independent researchers to do this work. So the one area we do, I think, have a better understanding of the impact is when Gen AI is used in more targeted harassment environments, particularly against women. It's study after study points to how more than 95, more than 98, 99% in certain studies, women are disproportionately being targeted with the use of non-consensual intimate imagery. We've got examples of that. One is from Bangladesh, when deepfakes of women opposition leaders were created that sexualized them to try to undermine their reputation and to push them out of public life. That's a very clear impact we see over and over. Other use cases that we studied, which I find really interesting, is how Gen AI was used in political campaigning. And this is where you saw just a mix, some for really, I would say, good uses, my favorite being from Belarus, where the opposition party created an avatar to run in the election because an avatar couldn't be arrested by Lukashenko. So I think that is wonderful and such a fun like troll of an authoritarian. And then you see some more of the problematic uses, I would say. In Indonesia's election, Prabowo used an avatar to try to rebrand himself. He eventually won the presidency there, but to try to rebrand himself as cuddly and cat obsessed, which on its surface seems, oh, sure, he's trying to reach youth audiences. But what it did is it papered over allegations, very credible allegations, that he committed major human rights abuses when he was in the military. So you see sort of a mixed case there. And then at the end of the report, we have an exploration of countries in which policymakers actually created new rules around how to use Gen AI in policy or in campaigning, some of which we really praise, some of which we think are a little disproportionate. But you do see concerns over how generative AI will use in elections drive action in a lot of countries.
As a way of getting a little more granular on this report and just showcasing how deep you go on each of these countries, I want to just throw out 3 country names and see if you can tell my listeners why they rate merit in your report. So a little bit of a grab bag here, but let's start with Kyrgyzstan.
So Kyrgyzstan declined more than any other country in our report, and it's been on this trajectory for a while. One thing I actually find really interesting is we also have a Freedom in the World report that looks at these countries' larger political rights and civil liberties. And Kyrgyzstan is interesting because I believe it's still partly free in Freedom on the Net. Keon is, I think, giving me a nod. And it's not free in Freedom in the World. And in some countries, you see it take time for this crackdown offline to go online, and it discrepancies. While in other countries, you see a flip. Like India, for instance, was actually way worse in internet freedom before the larger democratic trajectory. But in Kyrgyzstan, to your question, we saw an increasing crackdown against digital media. There's an investigative media outlet, Kloop, that their website was blocked. There were targeted investigations against them as well. They ended up having to shut down. And it's part of a larger goal of the president there to just increasingly tighten the space for critical commentary and for people's ability to access information. Kloop is really helpful in investigating government corruption, human rights abuses, so you can, figure out why they might have gone after them.
Chile.
So we added Chile to our Freedom on the Net coverage for the first time this year. It's really exciting for us when we're able to expand our coverage because it allows us to understand what different countries around the world look like when it comes to their culture of relating to the internet and how people experience human rights online differently in different contexts. Chile is also a very exciting addition because it has such strong safeguards for human rights online. Chile actually ranked third in the world, tied with Canada, and is, of course, the top ranking country in Latin America specifically. What we saw this year is that Chilean policymakers took really innovative and exciting steps to essentially enshrine human rights online in the country's legal framework. So in one measure, the policymakers recognized internet access as a public service, which is a really important baseline measure to ensure widespread access to the internet. And policymakers also separately enshrined a right to encryption, which of course is really important for people to access secure communications, to conduct business safely, to be able to express themselves freely online. Of course, there are some problems. I think Chile, actually many countries in the region, has struggled in some ways to translate a legal framework that criminalizes certain forms of insult into online expression. And so certainly previously there had been some pretty significant cases where those online insult laws had been somehow used to silence online expression or chill people's ability to express themselves online. Sometimes you just got to get in an argument with someone on social media, and you should be able to do that without being sued. But certainly Chile stands out as a really strong example of what it looks like to be able to experience your human rights fully on the internet.
And finally, I should point to what might be the most bloody war in the world at the moment, Sudan.
Yeah, Sudan's a really dark country report. I think for many years there was some sense of optimism about Sudan's democratic transition. The people of Sudan have been so resilient in fighting for their democracy and agitating in mobilizations, constantly calling for their human rights, calling for the military to respect the right of the people of Sudan to self-govern, to choose how their country is led. And we've seen these Sudan's pro-democracy movement survive through brutal government repression through the years, truly brutal government repression. Unfortunately, it's continued to get dark. As many of your listeners will know, the military essentially overthrew the co-governance structure that was established as a result of Sudan's pro-democracy mobilization, and then essentially two different arms of the military started fighting over control. So the military Sudanese armed forces on one side and the paramilitary rapid support forces on the other. What we see is that in their struggle for power, it's really the people of Sudan who have experienced the worst of it. The RSF, the rapid support forces, shut down the internet in February during a really brutal stage of the conflict. And as a result, people in the country didn't have access to the internet as they were trying to figure out if their loved ones were okay, as they were trying to access really critical medical and food support to access humanitarian aid. We've also seen that both sides of the conflict have really brutally cracked down on independent media. There are really credible accounts of torture that carried out by both sides, sometimes in retaliation for people posting criticism on the internet. And unfortunately, just to zoom out a bit from Sudan, we've seen that this trend of really severe repercussions for internet freedom during armed conflict is one that's been experienced by people all over the world. Sudan, Ethiopia, Gaza, and Nagorno-Karabakh. Unfortunately, people in all of these countries have experienced really severe repercussions for their ability to live their lives freely, to engage in their human rights online, because of the conflicts that are being carried out by armed forces all over the world.
So just a kind of a sampler of the various details that are offered in this report by your close to 100 analysts, I understand, all around the world who are producing this information. I want to maybe just finish up with a couple of high-level reflections of my own. You chronicle Brazil, for instance, and the kind of battle between Elon Musk and Supreme Court Justice Alexander de Moraes there. And I suspect we'll just see more and more of these types of conflicts between, on the one hand, government officials or judicial officials in different countries, and on the other hand, tech oligarchs, Elon Musk or Pavel Durov or various other executives or founders of tech firms. And that's partly because there's more regulation and governments are trying to hold these companies more to account. And also partly because these companies seem to have adopted, in many cases, an even more laissez-faire posture when it comes to being concerned about information integrity. How do you think about that, kind of stepping back from all of this, about the kind of reflexive nature between the behavior of American technology firms and governments around the world? These days, it's almost like a question of who's to blame.
It's really hard. And I know most of your listeners know that in a lot of these conversations, there's no easy answer. It actually is a lot easier when it's just like an outright authoritarian doing something really bad for free expression, like shutting down the internet during a protest. It gets a lot more complicated when it is a legitimately elected government, a democratic actor, like a judiciary in Brazil that is trying to grapple with really tough challenges and often really gross content and gross behavior and not overstep, right? And still get the strength and free expression and also tackle information integrity. I'll toot our own horn. In 2021, we actually looked at the growing sort of clash between companies and governments and what that meant for people's rights, because that was one of the years where you saw just such a influx of regulation that's targeting content, that's targeting data, that's targeting antitrust or competition. And you've only seen that grow over the past, 3 years ago? And I think one thing that we're trying to do, what we want to add to the conversation, is not only where is this happening, right? We can map Durov arrests in France, we can map Brazil, the block on X in Brazil, the Twitter ban in Pakistan, X, I guess now. See, I still want to call it Twitter. Not only where it's happening, but how do we think about it? What's the framework we should think about when you see these inevitable clashes, when there's good points on both sides? So that's what the report tries to do, where we actually lay out like a 4-principle framework of how, when governments want to tackle information integrity, which is a legitimate thing we need to address. The whole point of the report is to articulate how reliable and diverse information is central to democracy to function. So we believe governments do have a role in this, but we lay out 4 principles about how they can do that in a rights-respecting way. So one is operate with robust transparency. And that's one of the critiques we make about Brazil's judiciary and Justice Moraes, is that a lot of the orders to X were shielded in secrecy. So it's without that transparency, it's hard for us, it's hard for Brazilian civil society, to understand what the orders are, to understand whether they're legitimate under international human rights standards, and also hold X accountable and Elon Musk. We can't do that if we don't actually understand what the court is trying to do. The second principle we highlight is work closely with local civil society. These are the people that understand local context. These are the people that have this expertise, and they're going to help, if they're working closely with the government or with companies, help them not overreach or make sensitive decisions. We highlight a few examples in the report of good case studies about that partnership. The third one is operating independently, making sure it's not a politicized regulator that's making these choices. Generally, it is better if a judiciary is determining this stuff, Brazil aside. And then the last one is just adhering to international human rights standards. We have a universal framework that lays out in a very helpful way, what does proportionality look like? What type of restrictions on free expression are legitimate under what circumstances? So we're not reinventing the wheel here, right? Like we have something that the majority of governments have signed up to and agreed to commit to. So we really want to step in the debate to provide this framework and to provide a way of thinking about when these clashes inevitably happen.
We normally come on this podcast and we just talk about really depressing things. Is that these 4 principles that Ali mentioned, we actually found several environments where these principles were put into play. So we zoomed in on Taiwan, South Africa, and the European Union in specific interventions that governments or supranational institutions, as it may be, took to safeguard information integrity during electoral contexts. So this is a plug that if you want to actually see what this looks like in action, to check out our report on freedomonthenet.org, because we dive deep into those contexts to actually spell out what this looks like in reality.
You're right that these reports often do make for some grim reading. And I suppose if we've had 14 consecutive years of decline, we can at least say we know we haven't hit rock bottom yet. I suppose I'll talk to you again in a year and find out if perhaps we're there. It would be nice to get to that point so that we can see things start to turn, perhaps. But a lot would have to go right for that to be the case.
It'll happen one year. Things will go right, Justin. I believe it. I believe it in my heart that the work that you do, that we do, that so many in the community do is going to pay off at some point, and we will see that 1 year Freedom on the Net will show that global internet freedom has improved.
Thank you both for speaking to me today.
Always a pleasure.
Thanks for having us.
That's it for this episode. I hope you'll send your feedback. You can write to me at justin@techpolicy.press. Thanks to my guests, thanks to my co-founder Brian Jones, and thank you for listening.
Tech Policy Press.